Good afternoon and welcome to this International Code Council to the Point webinar. Today will be an overview of the ICC 300 2012 Bleachers, Folding, and Telescopic Seating and Grandstands. My name is Erica Frederick and I will be the moderator for today's call. If you have a question, you will be given the opportunity at the end of the presentation to type your question into the Q&A portion of the Adobe Connect box, and the speaker will respond to your question. Our presenter today is Ms. Kimberly Parlberg. Ms. Parlberg is a senior staff architect in technical services with the International Code Council. Her responsibilities include code development, conducting plan reviews, providing code interpretations, instructing technical seminars, and authoring and reviewing instructional materials, code commentary, and publication articles. She is also the ICC representative on the Development Committee for the ASCE 24 Flood Resistant and Design Construction. Please welcome Ms. Kimberly Parlberg.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. Let me give you a little bit of background then on this standard. We're talking today mostly about the 2012, but this is actually the third edition of this standard. There was one in 2002, which was the very first one, and then a second one in 2007. And this standard is specifically for bleachers, folding, and telescopic seating and grandstands. And basically the idea was to have something separate and unique for bleachers because they are kind of a unique structure on how they should be dealt with as far as public health, safety, and welfare. And there was a lot of effort in these to coordinate with the means of egress systems in the building code because you can have outside bleachers or inside bleachers, and once you've left the bleacher system itself, you are absorbed into the general provisions for the building code for means of egress. So they do go back and forth quite a bit to try and make sure that assembly seating, bleachers, and the general means of egress provisions work out together. So when this code was developed, it was developed, like I said, in 2002, and we are going to try and today just kind of describe the general chapters or how it was developed. When we were developing this, we did include code officials, bleacher manufacturers, and people who purchase the bleachers and use them like in sports arenas, etc. So we did try to get a balanced view of how all these things would work better for everybody within this standard. Today we're going to concentrate on the 2012 edition, which is referenced in the 2012 IBC. Chapter 1 in the standard is called Applications and Administration, and basically it kind of gives the whole scope and the purpose. That for establishing the minimum requirements for brand new bleachers, when you alter a bleacher, including when you repair them or when you would relocate them, operation of the bleachers, because we are talking about folding and telescopic seating, so you do pull them in and out, so that's what they meant by operation. But then also maintenance. If you've got especially exterior bleachers and you have to deal with weather concerns, you can have some bleachers that become unsafe, so it talks about inspections, that type of stuff. The next section, 102.1, basically sets the tone for how the book is divided up and which you use for which pieces. If you've got brand new construction, you comply with chapters 1 through 4. If you've got existing bleachers, you comply with chapters 1 through 2 and chapter 5. When they talk about permanent or temporary bleachers and permanent do apply with this standard, but temporary is typically less than 80 days in a calendar year. So say somebody puts out bleacher systems for parades or special events, you would add up the number of days that those would be used during the course of the year to determine whether they're temporary or permanent. For example, Mardi Gras in New Orleans puts up bleachers for parts of the parade, so it would be establishment of whether those would be temporary or permanent within their provisions. And it also addresses both indoor and outdoor concerns. The main thing, though, that I really think helps people out the most is to look in Chapter 2 at the definitions. I'm not going to bring up every definition today, but I am going to bring up what I think is the most important ones. The first one, of course, being the definition for bleachers. When we first started out, this just said tiered seating, and that got a lot of people confused. So the last cycles, they worked on clarifying that they're talking about tiered seating supported on a dedicated structural system of 2 or more rows. So in the picture there you see an example of a small bleacher like you might find at a baseball park, Little League, around schools, versus grandstands. But again, notice that the definition is exactly the same. Tiered seating and supported on a dedicated structural system, in other words, standing on its own frame, 2 or more rows high. So if you have a bench that is bolted down to a floor system, then that doesn't meet these definitions. So if you're looking really at the definitions differences between bleachers and grandstands, they are identical. There is no differential in size requirements that separates bleachers and grandstands. It's more of kind of what I would term slang. Most people would say a grandstand is a very large bleacher system because the manufacturer said basically they design and use the same criteria for the bleacher system no matter what size it is. They didn't want to differentiate between bleachers and grandstands at all. So we just follow the same set of rules for both. So the terms are interchangeable with the context of the standard. But like I said, slang is more commonly thought of the very large bleacher systems, even though it applies for both. This picture happens to be of the Indianapolis basketball stadium. That's the Harlem Globetrotters playing right there. But it's just an example of, in this particular situation, it's a concrete floor, tiered floor system where the seats are bolted to the floor. So these benches and seats being mounted on the floor are not considered a bleacher system. Now, this stadium was designed for basketball, but it does reconfigure itself. I have seen Katy Perry in this stadium. I have seen rodeos in here. So they do switch their floors and change the configuration. And when they do change the space, they will add seating on the floor, but then they will also bring in different types of bleachers that connect to their general seating assemblies. So you can have a building that is working with both fixed assembly seating out of Section 10 in the 2012 at Section 1028 in the building code, as well as the bleacher system, so they can be mixed and matched. The definition for folding and telescopic seating is, here's just an example where it's partially pulled out. And that's what it is. It's commonly found in high school gyms where it folds up into the wall so that they can use the gym without the stadium seating for when they're having gym classes, and when they have the sports events, they pull the seating out. There's also a definition for press box, which gives a very limited structural, is defined as a limited size structure attached to tiered seating intended for limited use. So basically, when they determine press box, they're only talking about the press box that's basically directly mounted and attached to the bleacher system. If you've got a press box that's not attached to the bleacher system off at another location, then that would not fall underneath this standard at all. There's a definition for smoke-protected assembly seating, which means seating served by a means of egress that is not subject to smoke accumulation within or under a structure. So that means that your smoke-protected assembly seating can be interior or exterior, and there's technical criteria for how you make sure that your stuff is smoke-protected. Most of the time, when you're outside, it's a smoke-protected assembly seating. If you're inside, it's a question of the shape of your roof and how high it is above your seating so that you can have smoke within the space, or a system that evacuates the smoke so it gives people a longer chance to get out. There are differences throughout the context for when you have smoke protected versus non-smoke protected. Smoke protected gives you a little bit extra time to get out, so they let you have narrower numbers to determine aisle width and that type of stuff. So that's why it's important to know that definition. I'll go into a couple other definitions as we go on, but those are really the main pieces up at the front that are related to the requirements. Now, Chapter 3 is construction, and basically Section 302 talks about permitted materials. It reinforces that a bleacher is not a floor system. So if you're doing your floor is rated because of type of construction, that's not going to be applied to your bleacher. It is not considered an interior finish. It can be combustible or non-combustible materials, and depending on where it's located, it also has to be weather resistant and non-corrosive materials. So the next section, section 303, deals with, and actually, sorry, the reason I've got that little light bulb up there on the right is because this is some of the new revisions that have been made to this particular section, and new revisions to the code for the 2012. The live load at 100 pounds per square foot was in there before, as well as wind, snow, and seismic being in accordance with the IBC. However, what they did do is that they've revised the sway loads so that they are consistent with AISC recommendations for unified LRFD and ASD provisions. Foundation design, again, consistent with the IBC as far as loads and type of materials. Section 304 is set up so that you are talking about floors under the folding and telescopic seating must be designed for the rolling load, as when you pull the seating in and out, how that works and everything. Section 305, the reason I wanted to bring this out specifically is because it's dealing with specific parts underneath the floor system. I'm going to open my book there, make sure I get this part right. Basically, 305 says spaces beneath or adjacent to the seating structure shall comply with the building code and the fire code. The reason I needed to check that out here is because there was a new addition to the 2012 building code under IBC section 1028.1.1.1 that talks about spaces under grandstands and bleachers. It says when spaces under grandstands or bleachers are used for purposes other than ticket booths less than 100 square feet or toilet rooms, the space has to be separated by fire barriers. So basically they're trying to protect the bleacher system from being affected by something that might be constructed underneath, used maybe for storage, concession stands, that type of stuff. This was not put into the bleacher standard because effectively it's not part of the bleacher. It's actually constructed under the bleacher and the bleacher's on top of it. So that's why the bleacher committee submitted this to the IBC to make sure that that separation was addressed for fire safety reasons. Fire protection is addressed in section 309 of the standard, where it talks about fire alarm systems for outdoor bleachers and how those are specifically addressed. There includes special unique provisions for temporary bleachers, systems with 300 or less, or bleacher systems with 15,000 or less. 15,000 is really based on the average high school stadium in the United States. Less than 15,000 would pick you up most of those stadiums, I think almost all of them, if I'm remembering correctly, versus something larger that might be more along the idea of the Indy 500 racetrack or some other large system like that. You would go to the building code for the fire protection system. There is a code change to try and coordinate these provisions in the 2009 IBC with the fire code so that there won't be any question for how those systems should be addressed. Section 310 refers you back to the building code again for accessibility, and accessibility standard that we use is the ICC A117.1 2009 edition. Basically, for a bleacher system, because of the structural system implications in it not being a floor system, rather than having to do dispersion throughout like you would do for a tiered floor system, you are allowed to locate the assembly seating cut into the entry levels of the bleachers. So if you enter the bleacher from the front, this shows an example of where they've cut out to integrate the bleacher seating in the first row. For people that are using mobility devices, if you come in from the top, then you would see those at the top. Section 11 talks about spaces underneath the bleachers and seat boards. That's limited when you have a drop-off of more than 30 inches from your footboard to an opening of less than 4 inches. You might recognize that 4 inches from our requirements that you find for openings in guards or openings in stairs. Basically, the 4 inches was chosen because that's the size of a small child's head, and they don't want to let people, fall and slip down between the bleacher row systems. So that if you have that kind of drop off from your footboards, not from the seat, but from the footboards, you want to make sure that you have that 4-inch circle as a protection level. That's basically the provisions under Chapter 3. Under Chapter 4, you have provisions mainly for the means of egress. And some of the defined terms that I didn't bring up when we talked about Chapter 2 but are important are they talk about the means of egress in total, which is the 3 parts: exit, access, exit, and exit discharge. And typically the bleacher system is considered an exit access component. In other words, you are getting from your seat, if you look at the red arrow there, through the aisle access ways to an aisle, which would lead you either off the bleacher system through a vomitory or through to an exit stair or door out of the space or room. So exit access along the bleacher system till you get to the exit from your space or off the system. The aisle being the main pathways, cross aisles or up and down. And aisle access ways are actually the space between the seats, between the front of one row and the back of another. So aisle access ways lead to aisles, which lead to exits. Transition areas is defined in Chapter 2 as change in slope of tiered seating sections or access to a platform or balcony from tiered seating. So a lot of times that can be viewed more of like a concourse or a cross aisle. When they talk about change in slope, there are some seating arrangements that use parabolic seating, but that tends to be more of a fixed floor seating than a bleacher system. The number of exits required in Chapter 4 are consistent pretty much with the occupant load versus how many ways you have to have off the system. So based on those tables, you have to have 1, 2, 3, or 4 ways off the system. You can choose the width of or design the width of your aisles based on the combination of the travel distance and the aisle width on capacity. And the aisle width capacity is if you have smoke protected or non-protected seating. So again, very similar to what you find for means of egress requirements. Is just if you're protected from smoke, you get a little bit of a break on how wide those aisles have to be. They did extensive revisions to Section 405 and 407 in this last cycle to try and clarify seats, and they also went much more specific about where you have seats with or without backs, because if you've got seats with backs on a bleacher system, then you are going to be more or less confined to your aisle access ways, versus if you have something more along the line of a bench seat bleacher system, then people could literally cut across the rows to a certain extent. So they tried to allow some different provisions for that. They also worked with the dead end allowances to try and address both from a distance of travel, which in the past had been 20 feet, but they also included counting the number of rows because it's more an issue of the number of rows feeding into the aisles that would affect your travel distance and number of people coming from different directions. So sometimes it works with feet, sometimes it works with number of rows. It has both options in there. Now the guard provisions and handrail provisions are also found in Chapter 4. Those are Section 408 and 409. So a guard really is what prevents you from falling off the backs or sides. And if you have an elevated system, you could also literally have a guard in front of the front row as well. They do allow for options for line of sight when you're dealing with a venue where you have a specific focus. For example, like a large football stadium. Guards are only required when you have a drop-off of more than 30 inches measured from the footboard. The perimeter guards, one of the new code change sections that they've been working on, is that because you're worried about people standing up on bleacher seating, especially in the back row, while you measure from the foot plate to see whether you need the guard to establish the guard height, you measure from the seat board. Handrails are a little bit different. Handrails are down the aisles to help people arrest the chance if they have a fall or for guidance. They are allowed to be discontinuous, unlike a regular stairway, because of people crossing back and forth between rows. And one of the revisions that they worked with on the handrails this time was how to address when you got down to that cross aisle, how far that handrail had to extend so that you didn't have to go down, too many rows down at the bottom without having a handrail to be able to grab onto, but at the same time allowed for people to put it out past the bottom row if they chose to, as long as it did not obstruct the cross aisle. So they tried to look at that both ways. Chapter 5 deals with existing bleachers, folding and telescopic seating and grandstands. There is a requirement both in Chapter 1 and Chapter 5 that they have to be inspected at least once a year. Section 502, they talk about maintenance and repair, and they did revise some provisions here for when existing bleachers were relocated, because I've been told from the bleacher suppliers that there's a lot of time that one school will order new bleachers and sell their old bleachers to somebody else, or they'll take them from one field and move them to another. So what do you have to do when you move versus new construction? How do you check the structural system? How do you reestablish foundations, that type of stuff? Also trying to address unsafe conditions where maybe you've got an old bleacher and some of the structural supports have rusted, or maybe the seating's gone bad in a certain place. How do you address those? Mandatory retrofits. If you've got a really old bleacher system, they are requiring guards and open spaces on footboards to be addressed, because they are concerned about the public health and safety and danger of falling. So once this standard is adopted, they would like you to retrofit existing bleacher systems to at least address that issue. When you relocate the seating, you've got issues for foundation, if it's sitting on a floor versus outside, what the ceiling height has to be so people won't hit their head when they stand up in the last row, if it has any electrical supplies, especially if it's underneath. And accessibility is required, but only if it's technically infeasible. So, and then a last reference again back kind of to Chapter 5 to say you have to comply with Chapter 5. Like I mentioned before, we do coordinate with the IBC. We've put in several different proposals to make sure that the new information and changes that we made in the IBC 2012 standard is also going to be in the building code and fire code with the next edition. And if anybody's interested in seeing how those work out, the final action hearings are on October 24th through 27th. They'll be held in Portland, Oregon, but we do broadcast those live. Anybody is willing to come out and testify if you really want to do so. If you see the any changes to the fire code that you think should be required, or if you want to watch the couple of changes that the Bleacher Committee has ready for the fire code, those need to be submitted by January 3rd, and those will be part of our next year's cycle. So that is our basic coverage of the ICC 300. Did anybody have any questions today?
Any questions that anyone might have, you can type them into the Q&A portion of the Adobe Connect box. All right, it looks like we have one question here. You had mentioned that the ICC 300 committee has submitted code changes for coordination with the IBC Assembly seating provisions. Can you tell me the progress of those changes at this time?
Okay, let's see. Basically, the perimeter guard criteria was passed successfully, and there are no public comments. So at the code change part we are right now with no public comments, so those will be part of the consent agenda. So that's finished and ready to go. There was some additional references to the ICC 300 that they asked for in the temporary and relocated provisions in Chapter 34. The committee said that because you were referenced to the ICC 300 for bleachers in general, that you didn't really need those. That was the Means of Egress Development Committee. The Bleacher Development Committee felt that maybe they should, rethink that a little bit. So they have reapplied, put in a public comment for those changes. The fire code change is still in process. That'll come through the next cycle. And the only other one that's still in play is the one that's coordinating with the dead-end provisions using rows and the additional allowances for aisle width with seats or without seats. That had a very positive greetings and testimony, but they asked for a couple of tweaks and some additional language and information. So we did go ahead and provide that information through the ICC 300 committee. So again, that's back in for public comment to see if those provisions will go forward. Again, it's not a conflict with the bleacher standard at all. It's just going to be, since this is a really good idea for bleachers, it seems consistent to have the same allowances if you have bench type seating bolted down to a floor system. So they're just trying to provide the same technical information that way. So again, please watch us live in Portland, or if you're really into these code changes, you can come and testify. Are there any other questions?
We have another question coming in. Do you have any idea how many jurisdictions are using the ICC 300?
Well, there's been several different bleacher manufacturers that have participated in the development of this standard. I know that when I've seen their products, they say that they have made sure that they comply with the ICC 300 in their development of their products. But basically, anybody who has adopted any IBC code after 2003, where we reference the first ICC 300 bleacher, it is a reference standard the same way we reference NFPA for alarms and sprinklers, the A117.1. So anybody who's on an IBC 2003 or later has this as a reference standard and should be using it for bleachers that are relocated, altered, or made new in their jurisdiction. We can check with our government service representatives, but I believe pretty much every state in the United States is on the IBC of some edition, and most are 2006 or later. Any other questions today?
Well, we're almost out of time, so if anyone does have any further questions, you can contact Ms. Parlberg. She can be reached at kparlberg@iccsafe.org or 1-888-422-7233, and that's extension 4306. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great year.